Hey guys, it's Keybros. So today we're going to react to Hong Kong student leader Joshua Wong's interview on George Floyd. Just a bit of disclaimer before we start. We have nothing personal against him. It's not a personal attack. It's purely that we find some of the flaws in terms of logic and facts in his interview that I want to point out and share it with you guys.
Right. We have no political allegiance whatsoever. We don't confine ourselves in pro-government or anti-government camps in either camps.
Yeah.
We're simply here to scrutinize some of the things that Joshua has said in his interview and kind of see if he's correct on certain issues.
Exactly, because we're actually rather centrist on the whole incident, and we want to point out that his view on the current situation really doesn't reflect what the views of most people actually are in Hong Kong, and I think that's worth pointing out to the world.
Right. I think although Joshua is a prominent student leader and he's quite involved in protests, I think as fellow Hong Kong students, as fellow Hong Kong youth, we have a responsibility to kind of show a different perspective.
Exactly. We do respect what you say, it's just that we disagree with that. So hopefully you guys can also respect what we say, and you may feel free to disagree.
Sure.
Yeah.
That being said, let's get right into the video.
Exactly.
And Joshua Wong is here with us in our studio. Joshua, thank you for joining us here on DW. That is a very clear message there from Carrie Lam. In our view, violence should be stopped for the benefit of Hong Kong. Why isn't it being stopped?
When we experience police brutality in the past 3 months, the only thing aware by Hong Kong people is no police, we have peace. And now is the time for Hong Kong government to conduct investigation commission and to investigate on police brutality.
So Joshua mentioned the issue of police brutality. I think there certainly has been some incidents of police brutality which should definitely be sanctioned and should be investigated.
Yeah.
But first of all, it is incorrect, or at least there is no evidence to suggest that the entire police force is institutionally brutal.
Yeah.
I mean, a few incidents of police brutality should not lead to calls for the entire police force to be disbanded.
Yeah.
And I think we both agree that there has to be some sort of investigation into police brutality.
Yeah.
But when members of the protesters call the police, and then they complain that the police was unresponsive to their calls for help, it's rather hypocritical, and it's also very unfair on the police, because I feel like most police officers are just trying to do their jobs, and they don't go out on duty with the intention to harm protesters.
Yeah, that's right. So basically what we think is that an independent commission should be done for the sake of rule of law. But it's just that we also think that only calling for the police to be investigated and to release all protesters for an amnesty is just purely hypocritical.
Right.
You either do both or you do none, but doing none is basically there's no rule of law. So investigating both the police and the protesters, I'd say, is fair to everyone and completely upholds the rule of law. And also what we find rather hypocritical is that actually some people, when they don't have any problems in society, protesters, they always call the police, they're black police, they're criminals, and they need to be condemned in society. But at the same time, when they need help, like when they've, let's say, got some of their stuff stolen, all right, they also actually call the police, which we find kind of hypocritical. Like, you either refuse to actually call the police for help when you hold such a strong negative view about the police, or actually you try to be objective to the police, give credit when it is due, but also give some sort of complaint if they violated the law. I think that's fair to the police and to everyone.
And I also think that it's very extreme when people say that, hakking seishinga, which is the idea that all police officers, whether it's proven that they have engaged in acts of police brutality or not, all of them, and even their families, should die.
Yeah.
Which is a very commonly used and shouted slogans at protests.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite appalling, isn't it? And it's certainly unacceptable by any standards.
We do support freedom of expression, but it doesn't mean it should be abused. And obviously calling for the death of the family members of the policemen is clearly, I think, way beyond the line. If you try to do that in, let's say, Western country, trying to call for the death of the family members of a politician or like the police force, see what will happen. And also one thing he mentioned is that like we should have no police. All right, that is completely to us unacceptable, because otherwise what do you want? Do you want anarchy? Is that a good way for society to function? That's no society, literally. Right. No law, isn't it?
So the idea that with no police we will have peace is absolutely untrue.
Yeah.
And it's quite a fantastical and immature idea, I'd say.
Exactly.
You keep talking about police brutality, but Joshua, I want to show you some pictures of some of the protests that we saw over the weekend. We have some pictures of some of the scenes of protests here. And these are scenes, we have to say, of violence, of protesters destroying property. We will see soon some pictures also of barricades and boxes being set on fire. These don't look like peaceful protests, Joshua.
Barricade is used to protect protesters instead of allowing police storm into the crowd during the peaceful protest. At the same time, I'm strongly aware that force has been used by protesters, but we're strongly aware that the only way out is for Hong Kong government not to stay behind of riot police and do nothing to allow clash and violence happen. Instead of blaming on activists, now we are asking where is President Xi and Carrie Lam?
So this idea that it is legitimate for protesters to set up barricades in order to stop the police from being able to arrest them is absolutely doesn't make any sense. Because how is it legitimate for a criminal to say, oh, I wanted to do this in order to protect myself from being arrested? It simply doesn't make any sense, and there's definitely no moral justification for damaging public property. And it's also quite important to remember that when they break into metro stations and they cause damage and arson even, I mean, how is that related to protecting themselves from the police? I mean, it's clearly hypocritical and doesn't make any sense.
That's right. And also actually want to point out is that we, both of us, all right, we do support peaceful protests, like, according to the law.
Right.
That is totally within the freedom of expression given by the basic law and should be exercised.
Right.
But when you engage in violence, okay, and these student leaders don't actually go and condemn these violence, it's actually very hypocritical, but also doesn't really help their cause. Because if they really want true international support, they want to stand on the moral high ground, okay, above the government or above, the police, they should stick to their own moral principles and be peaceful. If people have actually hijacked the movement to loot, to steal, to, destroy public property, or even killing someone, then I think that should definitely be condemned in any society, not just Hong Kong.
Right.
But don't you think the protests might have gone too far, Joshua?
I think the protests must continue with our calls on free election. Of course, no one would enjoy to see clash and violence happen, but with our calls on free election, the ultimate and fundamental goal of Hong Kong people is just asking for the right to elect our own government. We hope to have the right to vote.
So this point correlates to what we just talked about the moral justification that protesters often cite.
Yep.
And that justification is that because we do not have universal suffrage, and because apparently, according to their worldview, we have no democracy, democratic rights in Hong Kong, it is therefore justified for these protesters to engage in acts which could be characterized as domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
And I think it's simply illogical to say, because we are fighting for this so-called democratic cause, therefore we have the right to kill anyone who disagrees with us, burn anything that we don't like to see, including Chinese-funded companies or even local companies, which they kind of see there's a connection between these companies and the mainland.
Yeah.
I mean, it absolutely doesn't make any sense.
Right. I think one thing he did cap out, which is true, is that we don't have universal suffrage right now. But I think it is incorrect to say that we cannot even elect our own government. Now, obviously, it is a 1,200 member sort of election committee.
It is a small circle.
Yeah, small circle to elect the chief executive. We think that universal suffrage should be given according to the basic law and one country, two systems, because that is more democratic and also actually increases the legitimacy of the government. But to say that we have absolutely no rights is completely false. Because if you compare this to what happened, let's say, back in colonial times, where the governor, like Chris Patten, all right, has all been appointed by the crown, we at least have some amount of democracy. And don't forget the Legislative Council, which controls whether actually legislation can be passed or you can elect for members. All right, everyone has 2 votes. So I don't think it's that unequal as to we are living in an authoritarian state at the moment.
I mean, there definitely is an inequality of political power between different citizens.
Yeah.
But I mean, even in Western countries, for example, in the US, you have the Electoral College.
Yeah.
And in the UK, you have the House of Lords, which is entirely unelected.
That's right.
So to say that we are undemocratic or we have no civil liberties simply because we do not have what Joshua considers to be universal suffrage. I mean, would you say that the U.S. does not have universal suffrage because they have the Electoral College? I mean,
exactly.
Clinton won the popular vote, but Trump won the presidency. So, I mean, is that universal suffrage?
That's right.
So,
spot on. Yeah, and also one thing I want to point out is that according to the Democracy Index, all right, Hong Kong is ranked as a flawed democracy. Of course, we think that it can be improved and should be improved, but it's actually, if you compare it to, let's say, what Joshua always referred to, the United States, all right, US is actually also a flawed democracy. Obviously, we accept that it's higher than Hong Kong, but it shows that it's very hard to become a very so-called full democracy. Only perhaps Scandinavian countries can achieve that. And to say that we're not democratic, that's untrue, because objectively, we're not a hybrid state. We're not classified as authoritarian in the democracy, and we're actually a democracy, just flawed. Do you think so?
Right, I agree. I mean, obviously, we both agree that some sort of political reform is needed, given the political instability and social upheaval we're going through right now. But first of all, violence is never the resolution. And I mean, fighting for a democratic cause is no justification for burning or killing people. And secondly, the idea that we have no other alternative than violence to express our opinions is simply untrue. Because we have so many peaceful means, including the peaceful protests which took place over the past year.
You hope to have the right to vote. You were asking for democratic concessions, but the whole reason these protests started, and the reason we're seeing that violence that I've been asking you about on the streets, is because there was a bill introduced by the Hong Kong leadership to extradite to mainland China. That bill has now been removed. I mean, isn't that a sign from the Hong Kong leadership that they are willing to talk? I mean, we just heard Carrie Lam say we are willing to engage people directly in a dialogue. Why is the violence then continuing?
Pro-democratic camp lawmakers sent an open letter to Carrie Lam on 1st of July, urged to have dialogue. But from 1st of July till now, Carrie Lam never replied that letter.
But she's now replied. Isn't it time to take her up on it?
She didn't reply the letter. So we are really curious why at the same time the leader of Hong Kong handpicked by Beijing claimed that, oh, we are willing to have dialogue, but at the same time never reply any letter or any invitation from lawmaker from pro-democratic camp. From my point of view, political crisis must solve by political system reforms.
Right, so here Joshua actually said that he's not willing to engage in dialogue with the government because the government is not willing to compromise. Now, obviously, we do kind of agree that the government has done something rather wrong in terms of the bill. Like, it was poorly promoted in a very short amount of time. It should have given more consultation for citizens and also given more time. But we also have to say that the government, to be fair, that the government has actually compromised at the very end because it retreated the extradition bill. And one thing we also have to point out is that some of the demands, not all, but some of the demands by the protesters are basically unreasonable, unjustified, and hypocritical, like the amnesty point, which we talked earlier.
Right. And Joshua also talks about this open letter incident, which, to be fair, I'm not entirely aware of. But the idea that simply because Carrie Lam ignored their request for dialogue once, now that the chief executive has openly expressed her will, her desire to have a dialogue with the protesters, now they turn around and say, oh, because you ignored my open letter, I'm not going to talk to you either. That's kind of childish and immature, isn't it?
It is.
And I think in the 2014 to 15 sort of electoral reform, back then the Democratic Party, which is the biggest pan-democratic party in Hong Kong, they came to a compromise with the government. The other Democrats labeled them as traitors simply because they were willing to engage in dialogue and discussion with the government. And I think that kind of shows that the protesters are kind of coming in bad faith, while the government has nothing but good intentions.
And also one thing I want to say is that what the protesters are doing, like refusing to engage with the government, even after the government has retreated the bill, is actually creating a vicious cycle. Because no matter what the government has done, they're not willing to back down anyways. We think that if the government is actually compromised, it is also wise for the protesters to take a step back as well, because they can actually help to defuse the situation. And standing very firmly against a side which is already kind of compromised is kind of unfair, I have to say, and also doesn't really help their movement, really. I'm not telling them to forgive their demands or whatever, or abandon them. Just simply sit down with the government and talk. That can actually be more constructive and productive rather than just throwing bricks and petrol bombs every day.
And I think it's also kind of goes to show that the protesters themselves are quite disorganized, because when they say they refuse to talk, refuse to have dialogue with the government, I think in a sense they don't have anyone who can represent them and talk to the government on their behalf. The movement has become so extreme that anyone, as mentioned previously, anyone who even considers the possibility of having dialogue with the government is immediately labeled as a traitor. And also they have the slogan, which is which literally means 5 demands and not one less. That kind of shows their unwillingness to negotiate. I think in a sense, these 5 demands, which they know, I mean, apart from the extradition bill, which has been retracted, maybe apart from the investigation committee demand, the amnesty demand, the universal suffrage demand,
and the classification,
also the classification of writing demands.
These
demands are obviously not going to be met. And I think in a sense, when they're saying they're kind of finding an excuse for them to keep engaging in acts of violence, because they can keep on saying, oh, the government hasn't met our demands, so therefore we will continue to riot. But when you have these, for example, I mean, the rioters in America can call for President Trump to resign, but that's obviously not going to happen. I mean, eventually you have to come to a compromise as a matter of practicality.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's this saying in Cantonese that which means you actually try to go to the furthest extent. And I think that's actually what they're doing. They're trying to push the government into a basically unachievable corner. And that should be condemned. And also another Cantonese saying is like, I think, which means if you actually take a step back, it actually broadens your perspective and actually creates more opportunities. And I think that sort of mindset should be adopted by both sides to actually help the society move on from the conflict.
So what kind of reform are you talking about at this point?
Political reform means that we are asking for free election. Now the leader of Hong Kong is not elected by Hong Kong people. The chief executive is just a puppet of communist authorities. And we hope the leader of Hong Kong can be the one getting mandate from people and let Hong Kong, such a global city, can enjoy stability and prosperity.
So you're saying if there were free elections, these protests and that violence would stop?
If Hong Kong people can enjoy free election, we will not see any kind of protest continually in every weekend.
So Joshua introduces this idea that the Hong Kong leadership is simply a communist puppet. And I think when we consider the circumstances in which the extradition bill was brought to the table, it's clearly false that the Hong Kong government is simply a communist puppet. I mean, first of all, the extradition bill was instigated entirely on the Hong Kong government's own accord. Secondly, the Communist Party or the Central People's Government never intervened in Hong Kong's affairs.
That's right.
Until very recently. Which, I mean, the protests themselves have been going on for nearly a year by now.
Yeah, and also one point he mentioned is that free elections will bring what they call prosperity and stability. But is that really true? Like, you can actually see from what's happening now, it's actually the violent protesters that's destroying the prosperity and stability rather than not having so-called free elections. I mean, according to the Cato Institute, which ranks the Human Freedom Index, Hong Kong was ranked 3rd, all right, in 2018, before this movement, okay? Only behind New Zealand and Switzerland. The United States of America, which they always wave American flags. Okay, these protesters actually rank 17th. All right, 17th, which is 14 places below Hong Kong. A country, 17th, is telling a city that's third what to do. I mean, that's quite hypocritical, isn't it? Mm-hmm. The UK, also another flag that they like to wave, the Union Jack, right, is ranked, I think, 9th. Okay, it's probably because of what they're doing that is causing Hong Kong to drop from third to God knows what at the moment.
And also, Joshua has this kind of fantastical idea that once we have universal suffrage, all of these acts of violence and protests will end. I mean, you just look at the US, they have entirely free elections. I mean, at least by Western standards, or by American standards. Just look at the Black Lives Matter protest. Is universal suffrage a tool by which all issues, all social issues, all political issues can magically be fixed? I mean, just look at places like India, or I don't know, Ukraine.
India is a good example, I'd say.
Right. Yeah. Or other countries like Albania.
Yep.
Or I mean, Armenia. They have universal suffrage, maybe in name.
Yeah.
But does that mean they have substantial democracy, or does that mean they have stability or economic prosperity? No. I mean, there is no correlation.
Meanwhile, you're here in Germany, and also, and you're heading after this, we should say, also to the U.S. to meet with supporters there and lawmakers there. Over the weekend, I want to show you some pictures of what we saw the protesters doing there, waving U.S. flags. And we heard protesters there calling on the U.S. to liberate their territory. Joshua, this is still one country, two systems, but one country. So what exactly are you asking for on this trip?
So just let us make it clear. During the protest on the last Sunday, more than 100,000 Hong Kong people urged U.S. Congress to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Of course, with people voicing out the slogan of Free Hong Kong or Liberate Hong Kong, but we still strongly aware that Hong Kong is under the rule of Beijing and part of China's territories. The only demand for us is to have universal suffrage, then generate democracy. And we urge world leaders, when we are facing the threat of the troops moving to the border and how the martial law in Hong Kong might be executed in the future, now is the time for world leaders. They have the responsibility to safeguard Hong Kong's political and economic freedom.
Right, so in the video, Joshua actually welcomes American liberation and interference to increase and improve our democracy and freedoms. But actually, when you have a look around the world, whenever America goes and intervenes into a country in the name of democracy, it actually turns out to make the country worse. You have countless of examples: Vietnam, Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Guatemala, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the list just goes on. Take Libya as a very good example. Under, Gaddafi, all right, it's authoritarian, but it's got one of the highest literacy rates in Africa, one of the highest living standards in Africa. Once America came in, instigated a color revolution, he's dead. Look at what's happened. Revolution and war, constant civil war. Same with Yemen, same with Iraq, same with Syria, ISIS, terrorist groups, etc. So is that really what Joshua wants for Hong Kong? Mm-hmm. Is that actually good for the people of Hong Kong? Obviously not. Another thing is that President Trump, at the beginning of his presidency, and actually very lately in his cadet speech, which I'll link below in the description, has said that the US should no longer become a world police. And I totally support that. But please, President Trump, stick to your own words and stop meddling into the affairs of other countries, because it is to your country's benefit to strengthen your country's economy, focus on your domestic affairs, and not to go and, make America so aggressive in terms of its world's image. I think it can do both sides good.
Right. And I think this point is also related to how Joshua proclaims that he supports a one country, two systems principle. But then he asks America and President Trump to come and save and liberate Hong Kong, which is entirely clearly goes against the one country part of the one country, two systems principle. I mean, I think many of the protesters in Hong Kong forget that one country, two systems is not only about two systems, it's also about one country. When they cite the basic law and say, we have these freedoms that we ought to enjoy, and we ought to have universal suffrage in accordance with the basic law, they cannot ignore other parts of the basic law which appear detrimental to their cause. For example, they can't simply say, we must have universal suffrage in the sense that even pro-independence candidates can stand for election.
That's
I
right.
mean, even in Germany, neo-Nazi candidates, they obviously cannot participate in politics. They cannot participate in elections. In every country, there is some sort of filtering mechanism, whether procedurally or substantively. I mean, in America, you can either be a Democrat or Republican in order to become president.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, that's also a filtering mechanism, because in a way, you cannot hold extremist views. If you are a neo-Nazi, I mean, obviously, the Republican Party isn't going to endorse you.
Yep.
So in that sense, many people do not have the right to be elected. So is that unfair? Is that unfree? I mean, if we take Joshua's definition, then the entire world is unfree. It's undemocratic. Universal suffrage must operate within the one country, two systems framework, because that framework, that principle is enshrined in our mini constitution.
All right, pro-democracy leader Joshua Wong, thank you so much for joining us here on DW.
Thank you.
Right, guys, so I guess this ends today's video because it's already been quite long. We'll probably react to part 2 of his interview next time, so stay tuned.
Right. If you disagree with any of our views, be sure to talk to us through the comment section. And I mean, by all means, dislike the video, but just don't set us on fire simply because you disagree with us.
Yeah, that's right.
If you do like the video, make sure to like and subscribe to Keybros so that you can see more content from us.
Exactly.
Until next time.
Yeah, cheers, guys. Bye.